in Jesus, walk 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 in Jesus, little good shepherd, Jesus, walk in 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 Jesus, little shepherd, Jesus, let it hear Jesus, let it hear Jesus, walk in Jesus, walk in Jesus, walk in Jesus, walk in Jesus, little shepherd, Jesus, walk in 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 Jesus, little shepherd, let it hear Jesus, only Jesus in, only Jesus in it, only Jesus in it. I'll give my life to Jesus, I give my life to Jesus. I'll walk with Jesus, walk with Jesus, walk with Jesus, walk with Jesus. Really good shepherd, really shepherd. I'll walk with Jesus. I'll give my life to Jesus. I'll give my life to Jesus. Give my life to Jesus. I'll walk with Jesus. Jesus shepherd, really shepherd. I'll give my life to Jesus. I'll walk with Jesus. I'll walk with Jesus. Walk here, Jesus. I'll walk here, Jesus. Walk here, Jesus. Jesus shepherd, Jesus shepherd. I'll walk here, Jesus. Walk here, Jesus. Jesus shepherd, Jesus shepherd. I'll walk here, Jesus. Walk here, Jesus. Walk here, Jesus. Jesus shepherd, Jesus shepherd. I'll go walk with Jesus. Walk here, Jesus. Walk here, Jesus. Walk here, Jesus. I appreciate God, I appreciate God, I appreciate God. Walk here, Jesus. 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 Jesus shepherd, Jesus shepherd. I see children. 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 Walk here, Jesus. Walk here, Jesus. Walk here, Jesus. Walk here, Jesus. Jesus shepherd, Jesus shepherd, Jesus shepherd, Jesus shepherd. I walk with Jesus. I walk with Jesus. Walk here, Jesus. Jesus shepherd, Jesus shepherd. Jesus walk with Jesus. Walk with Jesus. I walk with Jesus. Jesus shepherd. Walk with Jesus. Walk here, Jesus. Walk here, Jesus.